I am truly honored to be in the company of the scholars that you have invited, and I simply have no idea as to how I got here, but I'm nonetheless grateful for your invitation. When I look at who has already been here and who's coming, it is most impressive. It is a most impressive as well as intimidating group. So I pondered, what could I possibly say in such a star-studded lineup that I don't understand how I ended up in the first place. After all, for heaven's sakes, I'm a teacher / special educator who is currently in rehab and accordingly is serving as dean. I seriously, I really do admire the fact that you've launched this lecture series titled The Landscape for Preparing Teacher Educators, Whose Knowledges, What Visions. I know firsthand the courage that it takes and the leadership on the part of the faculty and your leaders to generate an internal dialogue that has national and international applicability regarding the future of teacher preparation, the current context of the state of education in America and abroad, and when it comes especially to educating all children well. I am especially appreciative for the fact that your series seeks to unearth and deeply understand the possible future of university-based teacher education, what our critics have to say about our teacher education programs. I appreciate the fact that you're exploring and analyzing the worth of our teacher ed programs, as well as exploring the differences between reactive change and transformative change, and analyzing what leadership in teacher education is needed if we are to truly obtain transformative leadership. These are most timely and critically important issues for all of those involved in teacher preparation and in teacher education. So pondering these issues, I believe, will definitely add a much needed dialogue and conversations in a variety of different contexts. Though a very lofty task, I will do my best to add fuel to the discussion that are underway already, and to also offer some ideas as I hope that you will strongly consider them as you continue your internal dialogue, and I'm certain that your dialogue will indeed lead to national and international dialogues about our future. After all, you are teachers' college, right? So when you speak, most of us tend to listen. So what I'd like to talk to you a bit about tonight is our possible path to transformation aimed at moving us toward an equity and excellence social justice agenda in the preparation of teacher educators. Let's begin by saying that we're living through a very dangerous time. Everyone in this room is in one way or another aware of that. We're in a revolution situation, no matter how unpopular the word has become in this country. The society in which we live is desperately menaced. So any citizen of this country who figures himself as responsible, particularly those of you who deal with the minds and hearts of young people, must be prepared to go for broke. Or to put it another way, you must understand that in the attempt to correct so many years of bad faith and cruelty, when it is operating not only in the classroom but in society, you will meet the most fantastic, the most brutal, and the most determined resistance. There is no point in pretending that this won't happen. The paradox of education is precisely this, that as one begins to become conscious, one begins to examine the society in which he is educated. The purpose of education, finally, is to create in a person the ability to look at the world for himself, to make his own decisions, to ask questions of the universe, and then to learn to live with those questions. Is the way he achieves his own identity. But no society is really anxious to have that kind of person around. What societies really ideally want is a citizenry which will simply obey the rules of society. If society succeeds in this, that society is about to perish. The obligation of anyone who thinks of himself as responsible is to examine society and try to change it and to fight it at no matter what risk. This is the only hope society has. This is the only way societies change. That was a quote from James Baldwin, a talk to teachers on December 21st, 1963. I believe that it was and is precisely this notion of fighting and rejecting societal acceptance of the brutality against Black boys and men that prompted thousands of protesters from Ferguson and St. Louis, Missouri, to New York City, from New York to San Francisco, Oakland, and other major and small cities across the nation, to say enough is enough at no matter what risk. While I'm not advocating for violence by any means, when an oppressed people place their faith in a judicial system that is supposed to protect them and their democratic rights, and those processes fail them and treat them inequitably, it unleashes bent-up anger and frustration. It angers people because there's a pervasive belief in many Black and brown communities that is shared by white allies that Black lives really don't matter. In other words, Black blood is indeed cheap. Depending upon who you are, and especially if you wear a uniform, you can cause the death of an unarmed Black or brown man and not be held accountable by a court of law. While a lot of people believe that the protest and unrest was about Michael Brown, and it was an attempt to avenge his death, I believe it was less about Michael Brown and more about the conditions under which poor people, a disproportionate percentage of whom are African American and other people of color, live in every day in America. These conditions include living in abject poverty, living in fear of the very police that have sworn to protect them, preparing their sons from an early age to stop and put their hands up when they even see the police, being denied access to a good quality school, rigorous and meaningful curriculum, and well-prepared teachers who are able to validate and build upon their children's cultural frames of reference to teach them in spite of their zip codes. Although I am very clear that we're gathered here today to talk about the current state and future preparation of educators, and namely the preparation of educators at the doctoral level, I simply can't act as though it's business as usual when our society has lost its moral compass when it comes to equitable and equal protection under the law for Black and brown boys. Most importantly, because our education system is indeed a microcosm of the larger society, any attempt to move toward an equity and social justice agenda in the preparation of teacher educators has to include a commitment to exposing doctoral students to the social cultural context that has given birth and continues to maintain inequities and unjust conditions in American society and in the American education system. As we ponder moving toward an equity and social justice agenda in the preparation of teacher educators, we find ourselves in a very sad social and education dilemma, where many African American and other students of color still are being denied the promise of brown. Although we no longer have Jim Crow laws and whites-only signs legally and visibly posted that prevent African American and other students of color from attending schools attended by their white peers, make no mistake about it, we still have unexplained educational disparities on the basis of race, social class, and perceived ability, and segregated schools in 21st century America. In many respects, today's American public schools are remarkably different in terms of the student demographics from Jim Crow and court-ordered desegregation schools, but they still bear undeniable resemblances and similarities in terms of equity and access. For example, and some of what I'm going to share now will be basically a repeat for those of you who do this work yourself. I know we have some excellent scholars in the room who are also on the front lines of social justice and equity issues in education. So you just bear with me because you already know what I'm going to say. You've studied it yourself, but I want us to have a common frame of reference as we talk about some of these issues. For example, in stark contrast to historic public school data trends, in 2010, white students comprised 50% or less of the public school enrollment in 12 states, along with District of Columbia. Also in 2010, African American students were the majority student populations in both the District of Columbia and the state of Mississippi. Similarly, Latino students were the majority student population in Arizona, California, New Mexico, and Texas. Across all states and territories, the District of Columbia boasted the highest percentage of African American students at 77%, and New Mexico the highest percentage of Latino students at 59%. During the 2009-2010 school year, English language learners accounted for an average of 14% of the U.S. public school population. In our large urban cities, ELL students comprise up to 18% of the student population, and even larger percentages at individual schools. Despite enrollment of students of color at an all-time high, the teaching force is still overwhelmingly white and female. More importantly, the American educational system seems to lack the will and the courage to appropriately educate these diverse students. Failure to design and deliver instruction that meets the educational needs of students of color in general education is directly related to the problem of disproportionate representation of students of color in special education. Research has shown that when students do not perform well academically, do not behave according to the teacher's cultural expectations, when teachers do not know what to do with students due to cultural mismatch, and if the student just happens to be African American, these students are often the very ones that their teachers refer for special education. It is well documented that African American and other students of color are at the greatest risk of being referred for and placed in the judgment categories of high incidence disability categories that Dr. Connor and others have studied extensively, of learning disabilities, intellectual disabilities, and emotional disturbance. Once placed in special education, African American and other students of color are also most often the very students who spend the majority of their school day in segregated special education settings with limited access to the general education classroom, limited access to non-disabled peers, and a limited access to a rigorous curriculum, while their white middle-class peers with the very same disability labels are placed in inclusive education or general education settings. Therefore, it seems that regardless of whether African American and other students of color are in the regular American public school classroom or in the special education program and classroom, they are the very students most likely to receive their education in low-performing, high poverty, and segregated settings. Unfortunately, it seems that the more racially and ethnically and linguistically diverse American public schools become, the more troublesome the educational disparities, disproportionality, and the reality and depth of our education dilemma. instead of taking more prudent and courageous steps to ensure the future of America's greatest natural resource, namely its children, by educating all of them well so that they are prepared to excel and compete in a highly technological, globally diverse society, we seem to be regressing. As we conclude our commemoration and celebration of the 60th anniversary of Brown and ponder the future of university-based teacher education, it is quite evident that the American educational system is only working well for a fraction of the students it is charged with serving. Not for all, and especially not for African American and other students of color, poor children across the board, and students labeled as having disabilities. Many in the field of teacher education claim that they're concerned about equity and social justice these days. As a matter of fact, it's the new buzzword. If you look on everybody's website, you'll see social justice. So my question is, how can we have all of this social justice and still have widespread inequitable treatment of students? In urban settings, a disproportionate percentage of whom are African American and other students of color, and in other places around the country, and some would venture to say the world. Since one of the greatest threats to receiving an equitable education in the American public schools for African American students is disproportionate placement in special education, it seems most natural that social justice advocates, teacher education, urban education scholars, and critical special education scholars would unite in the fight to eradicate disproportionality and all other forms of educational inequity. Most importantly, regardless of how you identify yourself as critical scholars and concerned, responsible citizens who are fully aware of the stark inequities in the American educational system, might we be able to move toward an equity and social justice agenda in the preparation of teacher educators? I'd like to just share a little more contextual information. To start to understand and comprehend potentially why the American public education system seems to only work well for a few privileged children and families, we must fully understand its original purpose and intent. American public schools historically were designed for the purpose of serving the dual role of controlling and sorting children deemed problematic and undesirable by society. In 1779, Thomas Jefferson proposed a two-track educational system with one track for the laborer and one for the learned. This system would allow a very small number to advance from lower to upper classes by, and I quote, raking a few geniuses from the rubbish, end of quote. In 1805, the New York Public School Society was founded and developed a model of schooling that focused on obedience and discipline in response to what factory owners needed in workers. In 1851, the first compulsory education law was passed with the goal of, and I quote, ensuring that the children of poor immigrants get civilized and learn obedience and restraint, end of quote, so that they make good workers and don't contribute to social upheaval. Our public schools have long been used as instruments of segregation and forced assimilation, beginning with laws that forbade slaves to learn to read, removal of Native American students from their homes and placed them in boarding schools, and outlawed the use of languages other than English in public school classrooms. Sounds familiar? And criminalized children who did not attend school. Our American public education system was developed with a set of purposes explicitly stated in law and public policy to control and sort students according to the needs of the state. Our educational system was initiated and refined to meet those needs. Although current policies have moved from the notion of control and sorting into rhetoric about the provision of equitable opportunities and outcomes for all, it seems no surprise that reform efforts, particularly those aimed at providing an equitable education to students of color, all poor children, students with disabilities, and students in urban settings, are not working. This really begs the question of, is it possible that the American public education system has not worked to the benefit of African American and other students of color because it was not designed with them in mind? Additionally, have we been trying to fix a system that appears to be broken at its very foundation? Even if the answer to these questions is yes, given the globally diverse context in which we live, I contend that the American public school system and teacher education must now figure out how to transform themselves to serve children well that they were not designed to serve. Sorry, need a little bit of water. While the student body in American public schools is more diverse today than any other point in American history, African American students and other students of color continue to attend schools where the retention and graduation rates lag significantly behind those of schools attended by white and Asian students. Additionally, African American and other students of color are more likely to attend low-performing schools, as I mentioned earlier, and I'd like to give you some examples. For instance, in high schools, where 50% of the students are white, 16% are classified as low retention schools. However, in high schools where African American students comprise more than 50%, 67% of high schools were low retention schools. We're talking retaining them from when they enter as ninth graders to graduation. Similarly, in high schools where Latinos represented 50% or more, 48% were designated as low retention schools. The data also illustrate that 39% of high schools with 50% or more white students reported retaining, 91 to 150% of students. Now these data, I know it sounds kind of crazy, right? But these data come from the Condition of Education report. These are the U.S. Department of Ed's data. In contrast, high schools that serve more than 50% Latino, and African American students retained only 13 and 8% respectively. It also appears that higher percentages of African American students, Latino students, American Indian, and Alaskan Native students attend schools classified as high poverty schools when compared to Asian Pacific Islander students and white students. Now, the figures for those first groups that I mentioned are upwards of 30%. And for white students, it's 6%, and for Asian Pacific Islander students, it's 12%. Although the general education disparities between African American and other students of color and their white and Asian peers cause serious reasons for concern, the field of teacher education and education researchers should be equally as concerned about the fact that special education has become the new form of segregation in American schools. In the early definition of overrepresentation and disproportionality, disproportionality was said to exist, and now I'm preaching to the choir, so David, close your ears. Disproportionality was said to exist when a specific group's representation in special education as a whole and/or in a specific disability category, such as learning disabilities or emotional behavioral disturbance, exceeded its reputation in the general school population or in the special education program. However, in recent years, disproportionality has been determined using risk index on the basis of race and ethnicity. Now, mind you, it took many years for us to get to this point of the risk index, and most of us that do this work, we don't believe it to be a perfect system, but it's better than the system before that didn't report disproportionality or special education placement on the basis of race at all. So, however, in recent years, as I said before, it's based upon risk index. Although students serve under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act are representative of all races and ethnic, cultural, linguistic, and social class backgrounds, African American and other students of color are disproportionately represented and at risk for being labeled in the judgment categories that I mentioned earlier. And what I mean by judgment, we're talking about categories where individuals are, and we're talking about what we call, I guess the shop talk would be what we call socially constructed disability categories. We're talking about disability categories where there is often no obvious, visible kind of a disability, and they really are constructed by, I hate to say social norms because some of us don't think that they're normative, but they're really constructed by somebody's perception of social norms. And so they are judgment categories, and that's why we refer to them that way, those of us who do this work. So African American and other students of color are disproportionately represented and at risk for being labeled in these judgment categories of intellectual disabilities, specific learning disabilities, and emotional behavioral disabilities. For example, in 2006, of the percentage of all students receiving special education services across all disability categories by race or ethnicity groups, American Indian or Alaska Native students had the largest risk ratio at 13.86%, followed by African American students at 12.22%, white students at 8.5%, Latino students at 8.4%. Now, what that means, do you understand what I'm saying? So that means that, just to make sure that everybody is clear, that means that American Indian or Alaskan Native students are almost 14 times more likely to be identified as having a disability. African American students are 12 times more likely. American Indian and Alaska Native students, along with African American and Latino students, have the highest risk ratio for learning disabilities, which is also the largest disability category. And their risk ratios are going to be small because it's such a large category, but the risk is still there. So the risk in this instance for American Indian, Native Alaskan students would be 1.8, for African American students 1.4, and for Latino students 1.1. And you think, well, why would he even be concerned about something that seems like such a small risk ratio? Well, this is compared to white students at 0.77. Now, those some math people in the room? Okay. And Asian Pacific Islander students are at 0.39, okay? So although the category of intellectual disabilities is much smaller than the category of specific learning disabilities, which, like I said, is the largest category and accounts for over 50, I think it's about 51, 52% of all the kids with disabilities, or labeled as having disabilities, I should say. So although intellectual disabilities is a much smaller category, comparatively speaking, than learning disabilities, and only accounts for 8.6% of all students that are between the ages of 6 and 21 who receive special education services under IDEA. That's what we call the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act. African American students still have, even in this smaller category, they still have a 2.75 risk index, which is the greatest risk index for being identified and labeled as having an intellectual disability, compared to their white peers at 0.63. Therefore, African American students are 2 times more likely to be identified and placed in special education for intellectual disability when compared to their peers. Similarly, the category of emotional disturbance, or some states call it emotional and behavioral disabilities, is also a very small category. It represents only 7.5% of all students between the ages of 6 and 21 who receive special education services. But even despite its relative size, African American students are disproportionately represented here as well. African American students have a 2.28 risk index of being identified and labeled as having an emotional or behavioral disability when compared to all other racial ethnic groups. These realities have made some researchers and educators question the identification and placement practices that have resulted in so many children of color being placed in special education, and some have even dared to assert that racism and white privilege is indeed at work here to produce these otherwise completely unexplainable risks. And it's really kind of startling when you see the data, and the data, when you look at it, you have to look at it again and again, because it just seems to defy anything that makes any sense in terms of this perpetuation of this problem. Despite the intent and purpose of the historic Brown decision, the reason I keep coming back to Brown, for those of you who are outside of the field, I keep coming back to Brown because I don't have time to talk about this in great detail today. But the reason I come back to Brown is because the special education movement got its start on the heels of Brown. So after parents, primarily white parents, middle-class parents of kids with disabilities, saw Brown be successful, they then hired a team of lawyers, and I'm skipping over many years, okay? So those of you who are historians, please forgive me, but I have to skip over a few years because they gave me a few minutes to talk tonight. So I'm not giving you the whole full story because and I've written about that elsewhere, but I don't have the time to chronicle that. But the bottom line is they hired some lawyers and lawyered up and decided that they would pursue litigation as a means of being able to secure for their children services that they felt like had been denied them as well. Now, mind you, they had tried litigation previously, but they didn't have a legal precedent to be able to pursue these services. So just after Brown was decided, the decision came down, that's how we got moving towards some real traction that would ultimately end with the passage of Public Law 94-142 in 1975 that would subsequently be termed the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Okay? All right. Okay. And now that we're all caught up on history in terms of, and I just spilled a bunch of water, now that, now that we're really caught up in terms of why Brown is significant, okay? So despite the intent and promise of the historic Brown decision, white privilege and racism has resulted in at least what I call 4 subsystems of the American public schooling process as a whole. And I won't go into them in great detail tonight, but there's a paper that I wrote a few years, and at least this part of it actually is included in a book chapter that's in the handbook on urban education, if you want to pick that up to read a little bit more about it. But I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about it because I want to move on to talk about some other things. But the 4 subsystems, I do want you to know what they are. The first is a general education system for children who are disproportionately white and perceived to be normal or without disabilities. These students often attend schools where teachers are highly educated and credentialed, meaning that the teachers were not hired with emergency license, not prepared through quick alternative routes, and often hold a master's degree, and in many instances, even a higher degree, a Ph.D. in some instances, in the subject area in which they teach. Sounds like just the kind of school you want to send your kid to, right? More importantly, these students are exposed to a rigorous college preparatory curriculum, including all of the advanced placement classes, travel abroad programs, access to 3 or more foreign languages, the latest technology, state-of-the-art labs. The second system, and some of this I must give some credit to in terms of this system. There are a number of references that I have not read to you for the ease of reading, but that particular one, some of that research came from Ellen Brantlinger's, the late, great Ellen Brantlinger's work, and I just wanted to mention that as she was a good friend and mentor to me. The second subset in the American educational system is general education for students who are disproportionately African American and or of color and perceived to be normal or without disabilities. These students are likely to attend schools that we discussed earlier that are deemed high poverty, that have high turnover of teaching and instructional staff, have an extremely high number of less experienced, uncertified, and provisionally licensed teachers. They often have subpar facilities and learning resources, limited or no access to technology, one or no foreign language programs. They have few specialists like math, science, reading specialists, few advanced placement courses, and no travel abroad programs. And this is all in the research. I'm not making these things up. The third system is a system that is in the American education, and it's special education for students who are disproportionately white and perceived as having disabilities. These students may be prejudicially perceived by some as not normal, but may be of varying ability, some requiring no support to excel academically and to participate in all facets of life, some requiring extensive ongoing support just to maintain life, and certainly to acquire academic skills. These students are more likely to be fully included in general education classrooms at the schools described above in the first system, meaning that all of their educational supports, such as special education services, physical therapy, speech and language therapy, occupational therapy, are all provided in the context of the general education classroom. There are no pullouts in this system. These students are not segregated through pullout from their non-disabled peers. Many of them graduate from high school with regular diplomas. Typically, they are the students with disabilities who go on to post-secondary education. So when we hear that about 18% of students with disabilities are in post-secondary education, these are those students. The fourth and final educational subsystem is the special education system for children who are disproportionately African American and identified as having disabilities. Like their peers, some of them may not really have disabilities, but they are varying age and ability, all the things I said to begin with. However, unlike their white peers, they often are excluded from inclusive education programs and the general education curriculum. They tend to spend 40% or less of their school day in the general education classroom, which means that they spend 60% or greater of their entire day in segregated special education placements, with some of these students even spending their entire day in separate classrooms and separate schools. It's kind of hard to believe that this still happens in America, right? But it does. They're also more likely to have quickly prepared and uncertified or provisionally licensed teachers and graduate from high school with a certificate of attendance or completion rather than a high school diploma. I shared this contextual information regarding the treatment of students of color and students perceived as having disabilities in the American educational system because I think one of the criticisms that has been and continues to be levied against university-based teacher education programs is the fact that our research, our theory, and our practice has not been robust enough to disrupt the failure of the American educational system to meet the needs of all of its children. And quite frankly, I'll tell you, I think that's a fair criticism. You know, I don't think, as to speak in the vernacular of my son's generation, I don't think that's haters. I really don't. I think that's a very fair criticism because the American educational system is not serving all of its children well, and particularly not African American, other students of color, who are often concentrated in urban settings. And there are inequities everywhere, so I don't want you to walk out and say, well, I've had it confirmed by Dr. Blanchett that inequities only occur in urban settings. They occur everywhere. As a matter of fact, how much time do I have, Celia?
20 more minutes.
Oh, okay, I got lots of time. Okay, as a matter of fact, I want to share with you a little bit about how some of the information I was sharing with you in terms of those 4 subsystems. I want to tell you a little bit more about, you know, how I came up on that. Some of it's, of course, just in the research, but the other part of what I'd like to say is that I got an invitation a few years ago to go to the state. I think I can talk about it now. I'm trying to remember. I better give you a state, because, you know, a lot of times when you do this work, they make you sign these things that you'll never talk about what happened, right? And certainly I wouldn't want to break anything that I said that I wouldn't do. But I went to a state in the Northeast that shall remain nameless. And I was a part of a team of individuals that was asked to come in as a result of a class action lawsuit in the state around the treatment of kids with disabilities. Now, the much larger issue was around the fact that they were just out of compliance and kids didn't have access to services that they need, that sort of thing. But in getting there, we discovered a number of things. And one of the things that we discovered was that there was a real serious problem with students for whom English wasn't their first language. So a lot of kids had moved into this state. This is a state that is known for their education system, okay? So they're just another one of my son's generation were just saying what I'm saying, okay? All right. So this state is known for their high quality educational system. Parents in this state pay a lot of taxes to have access to this high quality system. But yet this system wasn't working for students with disabilities. So this big lawsuit came about. And so the lawsuit had come about and it had kind of been settled, and they came up with all these remedies that the state had to enact in order to be in compliance with the ruling. And they thought they'd done a pretty good job, but the original parents that were behind the lawsuit felt like they still hadn't seen what they needed to see, so they asked for an audit. And they asked that they find researchers from around the country, bring us in and have us take a look. Well, what I noticed, and I noticed this pattern, and we were kind of like in teams, and we went to various schools around the areas that were most impacted, because anytime you start to look at something like this, you can almost quickly figure out where the problem is. The problem is going to be where you have the most kids of color. Not that kids of color are the problem, as I said earlier, but the problem is that when there's a sprinkling, and I got this from Beth Harry, and I didn't believe it when I first heard her say it years ago, but Beth Harry said, when you see a sprinkling of children of color in what would otherwise be pretty white schools, you don't see many problems with disproportionality. But as you see the numbers of children that are from other races increase, you also see the special education program start to boom. And at that point, when Beth was saying these things, she was basing it on some case studies that she had done, because the data wasn't really available in any usable form from the U.S. Department of Ed. But now we can look at the data and you see, oh my goodness, as the numbers of kids of color go up, the program in special education gets larger. And guess who's in it? So in this particular case, it was around Latino children. And many of them had come into the school system, were evaluated, not in their native tongue, but they were, weren't we supposed to have gotten away from all of that, right? That's actually discriminatory practice. But they were evaluated using English. And then as a result of those evaluations, they were assigned labels. And then based upon the labels, they were placed in classrooms, most of whom were placed in segregated settings, okay? Well, I found a young lady who I had her file from 3rd grade. And when she was first placed in special education. Some years later, when I show up at her school, because what we did, we found the kids. So we were able to find the kids that would have been in the system when this action initially happened. I keep talking, you're gonna figure it out. But anyway, when this action initially happened, I'm keeping my word. And then we were able to then figure out, well, where are they now? And some of them, as is often the case with poor children, they'd gone back to their original country, or, they'd moved. We couldn't find them, but a good number of them, we were able to find them. So I found this young lady sitting in a 10th grade calculus class. Now, she was identified as having moderate intellectual disabilities. Now, some of you are special educators, right? Come on. What does that usually mean? Just tell me. Tell the group. What does it usually mean? Someone who has a moderate intellectual disability. Give me some sense. Not everybody is the same. They're all different. We know all that. But give me the generally kind of accepted kind of notion of what their ability level might be. Okay, I heard it won't be chemistry and it won't be calculus, right? Well, and that's true. It wouldn't be college. It probably wouldn't be college preparatory work, that sort of thing. It would be probably much lower level academic work. So I found this, pardon me? Life skills. Thank you. It would be what they call daily living and life skills, right? It wouldn't be calculus. But she was sitting in this class doing exceptionally well. I interviewed the teacher at the conclusion of my observation, because what I was supposed to do was to find her, review the files, go visit, see what's happening in her classes and that sort of thing. So I visited several of her classes. And I talked to the teacher afterwards because, you don't know, well, maybe, she's just sitting there, right? But I saw her answering questions that the other kids couldn't answer, okay? She was doing exceptionally well. And she had also been very fortunate, because what also doesn't happen, we usually don't see kids get out. But that's a talk for another day. And David and I did some work a couple years ago, I guess it's been now, where I wrote a paper talking about the extent to which kids get out. And that's the reason why this is a problem, people. It's a problem because if kids got placed in special education and they live fabulous lives, they got all these great services and so forth, if that really happened, well then we wouldn't really having a label is still a problem, but we probably wouldn't be as upset about it. But that's not happening. But this young lady was doing exceptionally well, and I contacted the teacher a couple of years later. I said, do you know what happened to her? And he said, she's in college, and she's doing very well. But that's a very rare situation. Okay, I need to wrap up here. So another criticism is that has been lodged against teacher education is that even as teacher educators who are in the business of preparing the next generation and all future generations, I should say all, but many future generations of teacher educators, we ourselves have not demonstrated a consistent commitment to social justice in terms of being actively concerned about the plight of students with disabilities, to the point that we act within our own spheres of influence. In fact, I've stated previously in my work that general education researchers and teacher educators have been largely absent in calling attention to social and educational inequities that African American and other students of color, along with students labeled as having disabilities, have actually experienced. I'm going to do some skipping now because there's a few more things I'd like to share. Therefore, I contend that to move toward an equity and social justice agenda, we desperately need to capture those of us who really believe that it's time and necessary to act. Accordingly, and I know you had some conversation when Professor Zeigner was here about these different kinds of people and what they do and that sort of thing in terms of categorizing our critics. But I really believe that we should come up with a different way of viewing our work. We should actually be equity and social justice warriors. You see, contrary to the prevailing rhetoric that some of us in university-based teacher education programs are adverse to reform and transformation, I know that this isn't true because some of us have been on the forefront of every major reform effort of our time. From the Holmes Group, Holmes Partnership, I remember, Leanne was back there too, to the Great City Schools movement that's still in action, Teachers for a New Era, Gate Small Schools before we realized that anyway, and more recently, Teacher Quality Partnership Grants. In fact, some of us are the actual products of these reform initiatives aimed at preparing a different kind of teacher educator who would push the boundaries in traditional teacher education programs because we are and were uniquely prepared for transformation with a focus on equity and social justice. So to answer the question of what might transformational leadership look like, and I'm rushing now because I'm almost out of time. Okay, she says slow down, okay. So to answer the question of what might transformational leadership look like, transformative leadership would call and argue for replacing the current accountability and reform agenda that is focused on maintaining the status quo with an equally powerful equity and social justice agenda in which we reinvent ourselves by shifting the conversation from fixing what is wrong with our current teacher preparation programs to asking the right questions. For example, we might ask, is it reasonable for us to continue historical and out-of-date practices of holding children and ourselves hostage to an educational system that is predicated on sorting, tracking, and controlling? How might we disrupt and dismantle the faulty, racist, and white supremacy assumptions that undergird the foundation upon which our society and educational system was built? Now, I have a few more things I want to say. Hope you guys don't distribute this video too widely because I'd really like to go home and keep my job. But when I first started thinking about some of these issues many years ago, I'd say several years ago, probably, I thought about it most deeply in a paper that I wrote in 2006 in The Educational Researcher. And the more I've thought about these things, the more I've thought, we really need to do something more radical than what we're currently doing. What we're doing isn't working. So should we keep tinkering with something that's not working, or might we consider doing something else? So I'm giving you a little heads up. This is a little radical where I'm going, okay? So how might we disrupt and dismantle the faulty, racist, and white supremacy assumptions that undergird the foundations upon which our society and our educational system was built? Other questions that we should ponder include, what will it take to create learning environments that no longer seek to control children and their behavior, but are geared towards unleashing the genius in our children? What will it take? These are questions we need to answer and ponder. What will it take to create an educational system that demonstrates to children and their families that we really do believe all children can learn, and how they demonstrate to us, and how they demonstrate that to us doesn't have to be in a one-size fits all high-stake context. If our current system of education is indeed transformed, and we really, what I'm really calling for is to blow it up, right? If we really blow it up, what are the implications for schools and schooling? What are the implications for the practice and profession of teaching and teacher preparation? What might this kind of social justice transformation look like in a teacher preparation program? I believe that it looks like a doctoral program curriculum in teacher education that would afford its students the opportunity to see our transformative leadership for equity and social justice in action. It looks like a faculty that's engaged in collaborative interdisciplinary research with local, national, and international communities, working alongside their doctoral students, focused on solving some of the most significant and vexing, persistent problems of teacher education practice in reciprocal partnerships with local communities. I call this socially transformative research and scholarship. It also looks like, my third point, it also looks like research that is not conducted just for the purpose of advancing knowledge, but for the purpose of transforming the lives and everyday living conditions of students, families, and communities that need it the most. It also looks like we would no longer tolerate and perpetuate gross inequities and unjust practice in our schools and colleges of education. And finally, if we really were to take this whole notion of equity and social justice seriously in the preparation of teacher educators, we would raise the status of teacher education within universities and colleges and truly value the work that goes into preparing excellent teachers and teacher educators who will be on the front lines of the fight for equity and social justice. I said I was going to have one more. And finally, we would provide faculty recognition, promotions, and awards for their individual and interdisciplinary socially transformative research and teaching. In closing, the current landscape in teacher education must be disrupted, but it has to be disrupted by individuals who are themselves committed to an equity and social justice agenda in teacher education and society. After all, as Baldwin stated, and I quote, "The obligation of anyone who thinks of themselves as responsible is to examine society and try to change it and to fight it at no matter what risk." Thank you so much for your time. Thank you.